Welcome back. So we are going to get a little more into the actual course content now. We're starting with the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta, some of you may say, well, that's a British, well, no, there was no an English document. Well, it had great influence and quite a bit to do with influencing the documents that we have in this country today. It was a great influence when the founders came together at the Constitutional Convention and hammered out the Constitution, when Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence. It's been around. It's certainly something worth studying. I also want to show you all that the Pilgrims didn't just get off the Mayflower in the 17th century, and then now we have this country that we live in. That there was something before, that there was a gradual step and evolution in human freedom that started a very, very long time ago. So, it's one of my favorite poets, Rudyard Kipling. So we're going to look at what happened at Runnymede, which is where the Magna Carta was sealed. At Runnymede, your rights were won at Runnymede. I know this isn't a poetry class, but if you're into that, check out Rudyard Kipling. Mandalay is another good one of my favorites. So the Magna Carta, a document, right? Sets out a bunch of laws, which the King of England was not above. And this was a novel, this was a revolutionary concept at the time, because back then the king was believed to have been chosen by God, by divine right. It was called to be who he is, or was rather. If you went against the king, you went against God, and nobody wanted to do that and risk going to hell. Quite literally, that is what they thought. Here is a law which is above the king, and which even he must not break. This reaffirmation of a supreme law and its expression in a general charter is the great work of Magna Carta, and this alone justifies the respect in which men have held it, says Sir Winston Churchill. I hope you know who Winston Churchill is. So what is this? There are 63 clauses in Magna Carta. It defines the rights of the king, defines the rights of his nobility. The barons is just a general blanket term for that, and a number of other groups. Notably not anybody who wasn't the king, the nobility, the clergy. People like you and me would probably, well, not probably, were left out of this thing. So Magna Carta outlined basic rights with the principle that no one was above the law, including the king. And this is the lesson of Magna Carta. This is one of the big lessons of Magna Carta, rather, because there's other things to learn here, that the king was not above the law. And believe it or not, this is the first time anybody really bothers to write that down. Ideas. This is the big lesson. This is another one of the big lessons. Ideas are hard to kill. Once an idea is out there, the king is not infallible. It's hard to put the genie back into the bottle. So it chartered a right to a fair trial, put limits on taxation without representation. So all great stuff. We aren't quite at the point where, a charter like this, because we're back in the 13th century, we're not quite at the point where a charter like this would have applied to the likes of you and me. So as I said, Magna Carta inspired the U.S. Constitution. Magna Carta inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a document that the United Nations put out. It was an unnamed document. It wasn't called Magna Carta until many years after the fact. Magna Carta is just Latin for the Great Charter and began to be known some years after the fact as the Great Charter. And again, let me just remind you, again, if you see something like this, something that's, in yellow or some different color, that's in bold, maybe, that you're probably, and take out the word probably, you will see that on an exam. These are kind of the big important points. So we only have 3 valid clauses that are surprisingly that are still on the books today. One guarantees the liberties of the English church. And the English church wasn't the English church back then. The English church was the Catholic church in England. If you're up on your history, the English church or the Anglican church wouldn't really become the Anglican church until the reign of Henry VIII, when the Pope wouldn't grant him his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So the clause, there's a clause confirming the privileges of the City of London and other towns, and I should say that the City of London is not the City of London that you're all thinking of. Say this square. If you just look on them, just pretend with me. Say this square is London. If you look at a map of the United Kingdom. All right, the actual City of London is a financial center about a mile in diameter, about a mile wide and a mile long, located within what is called London. So the City of London is referring to this little square, so to speak, within the bigger square. And a clause that states that no free man shall be imprisoned without the lawful judgment of his equals, which in a reworded and reworked way made its way into our Constitution. Again, here is a parallel. Here is why we are talking about this. It directly relates to what this course is supposed to be about. There is a method to my madness, I promise you. So this, let me clear this. This is a picture I took. This is Westminster Abbey in London, and I was fortunate enough to study abroad there for a little while. I attended some services at the church. It was just beautiful. The service was beautiful. The services were beautiful. The inside of the chapel is just magnificent. This is stunning. I got on the ground. I was on my stomach on the ground, and I had the camera up like this. It's just great. If you ever get a chance to study abroad after the virus has passed, please do. You won't regret it. So this charter was issued. It was followed by an uprising, which we'll talk about. I'm just giving you an overview of what to expect, in this lesson. It's an overview, a brief overview of what this story of Magna Carta is going to be about. But there was an uprising, which the nobles had against King John. And the charter here has been described as performing a peace treaty. I'll jump ahead a little bit. The peace treaty lasted all of about roundabouts 3 months between the rebel barons and the king. And this is another picture of mine. I took this inside when I just did a self tour of Westminster Abbey. Again, just a wonderful place to visit. All right, so who's King John? King John's kind of one of the villains of our story. I say one of because the honest truth is the other side wasn't that much better. He was born 1166 or 1167 in Oxford, in England. He was the youngest son of Henry II, who was his father, the king, another king of England. John was not supposed to come to the throne. He had an older brother, Richard, who you might have heard of in history classes, Richard the Lionhearted or Richard the Lionheart. Richard didn't have any children. So he is described, John, we're back on John. He is described in some history books as John Lackland. And the nickname is pretty self-explanatory. He was called John Lackland because, boy, did he lack it. He inherited a great empire, I guess kind of the first English empire, if you will. It didn't extend all that far. I guess pretty big for 1166, 67, but he presided over the erosion of that because he lost most of these lands to France. England had a big claim on French territory because they intermarried with the French nobility. You know, they inherited, they won lands in wars, won territories ceded to them through treaties, things like that. Went away when John was ruling. Lost most of these lands while his brother Richard was away on crusade. And this is John Lackland. So John came to the throne in 1199, roundabouts. His brother Richard had died, finally, to John's mind. Again, John, not a great individual, not somebody you'd probably want as a member of your family. John, had attempted to coup d'etat, tried to seize the throne of England from Richard while Richard was imprisoned on his way back from a crusade in Germany. King Richard only, grand total, spent about 6 months. No more than a year. I'm pretty darn certain it was about 6 months, but no more than a year of his reign in England. He was always fighting in the Holy Land on crusade. And the hallmark of John's reign was this war with France. He was always at war. All right. So wars cost money. Again, I will draw your attention to the fact that this point is made to stand out. So John invented this tax to pay for his wars. He called it scutage. He made it up. He paid it, but it was meant to pay for the wars. It proved to be very unpopular with his barons, his nobility. How it kind of worked back then, the king would say, all right, we're doing this. You know, I need this money, I need this tax. And it would be up to the nobility to go get it for him from their lands and their tenants, their people, and send it back to wherever the capital, or wherever the king was, rather. So I imagine the nobles probably were hearing about it from their tenants, which might have made life a little difficult for them. But again, we have this idea: no taxation without representation. So John really became rather ruthless in collecting and levying these taxes. He exploited his feudal rights, his ancient privileges and prerogatives as king, and exploited them big time, and caused massive civil discontent, massive civil unrest. The barons said, enough is enough. Your Majesty, we need to talk about this. we need to fix this in some way. So the barons rise up. The barons seize London. John puts his what's going on here? John puts his seal on Magna Carta in 1215. He didn't sign it. He sealed it. Now, what is a seal? Some of you might ask. So there would be like a stamp or maybe a ring that the nobility would use, and they'd have, a shape that was distinctive to them. So like that, and they'd quite literally dip their ring or their stamp or whatever they used in wax and put it on there, and that's how they knew that the king had signed off on this. So seal, not sign. Definitely remember that. So John kicks it a year later in Newark Castle after contracting dysentery in the east of England. So he did not meet a fun end. So this is the Angevin Empire at the time of King Henry II. So John and Richard the Lionheart's father. As you can see, it's not a whole lot, but based on what they had later, the sun never sets on the British Empire, but all of this was directly under their control. All of England, right? Most of France, quite a bit of France anyway. They had married into Aquitaine and their noble family, so they had direct control of everything I just highlighted. Vassals, as you can see up here, those guys just kind of did what Henry said. So vassals, would be in South Wales, this much of Ireland. So they held influence in the British Isles and quite a bit of France. This is Henry II, who had a nice, very long life for that time, 1133 to 1189. So that's John's father. So now we get into it. What led up to Magna Carta? Why did this have to happen? What caused this to come to be? So John, as we've discussed, was not, a particularly nice individual, kind of a ruthless king. So he's excommunicated in 1209 by the Pope, and an excommunication means that you can't receive, if you're Catholic, you would know this. If you're, it means that you can't take communion, you can't participate in the Christian life of the community. The Pope, not the popes, but the priests rather. There's only one Pope. The priests can't offer any Christian services like a burial or wedding or a baptism. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is still the head of the head priest rather of the church in England. It's a big deal. Typically, how it would work back then is the Pope would write to the king and say, hey, you got any uh, names for me for the Archbishop of Canterbury? There would be some sort of back and forth. But in this case, um, there was not. The Pope really had his mind set, and this is Innocent III. This is the Pope we're talking about. On one individual, the king had his heart set on another, and this led to inevitable conflict. So there was an incumbent Archbishop, Hubert Walter. He died in 1205. So the monks in the chapter, and this is where they would have deliberated and talked. This is Canterbury, the inside of Canterbury Cathedral. They were really divided as to who to elect. So the king said, monks, I am your king. You will elect the Bishop of Norwich to this post, to this lofty post, right? The Pope, on the other hand, wanted Stephen Langton and ordered the monks to elect him. So the monks here were in an impossible position. On the one hand, if they disobey the king, well, the king might seek some sort of revenge, some sort of retribution. Maybe he'll send soldiers in and cut their heads off. On the other hand, the Pope is who they're supposed to be working for. The Pope is their spiritual father. The Pope is who they look excuse me. I've told you, my mind sometimes goes faster than my mouth. The Pope is who they look for to provide spiritual guidance, to provide kind of a route to heaven. So who do they save their bodies? Do they save their souls? Well, they went the soul route. They elected Langton, and the Pope consecrated him as Archbishop of Canterbury, which has jurisdiction over all of this, really. But what you see, what I'm highlighting, is really, there's another Archbishop for up here. He's called the Archbishop of York, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is really the head honcho in the Church of England. So the king doesn't take this line down. He says, I'm not going to accept Langton. I'm not even going to go so far. I'll go so far, even I'm not going to let him into the country. So fine, the Pope pulls out another, this is the outside of Canterbury Cathedral, spiritual tool in his arsenal and places an interdict on the whole of England. So no priest, prelate, anybody associated with holding an office under the Catholic Church and the jurisdiction of His Holiness the Pope could perform marriages, bury people on consecrated ground, again, work with the baptisms, all that. And this was so, today you might ask, well, what's the huge deal? I mean, but you have to remember, put it in the context of the times. It's 1208. The church is everything. The church is what people's lives center around. They connect with people in their community in that way. They need this in their lives. They truly believe if they get on the wrong side of the Catholic Church, they're going to go to hell. So it's a powerful tool to deny somebody back then the Christian sacraments. And I make no comment on anybody's religious beliefs or anything like that. I'm just telling you what the thinking was back then. So King John gets excommunicated again. Never, can stay on the right side of Innocent III. King John's excommunicated. In 1213, the Pope announces a sentence of deposition And this is the big tool. This is if this doesn't work, nothing's going to. He authorizes Philip II, King of France, I almost said Spain, King of France, to wage a war against England with the intent of removing John from power. So he says, this guy is no good. This guy is an illegitimate king. This guy is, you don't owe him your obedience. My children, God will forgive you if you raise a hand against him. It can't, go on this way. So this is a big deal, this sentence of deposition. And France utilizes it a little later on in our story. So the king, meanwhile, says, hey, you know what? Since I'm excommunicated anyway, and I'm still at war with France, and I'm still trying to, recover my lost empire that my father graciously, left me and my brother, you know, I'm going to confiscate church property since I'm no longer in the church. They've kicked me out. It's his own fault. Uh, so I'm going to sell this church property back to the bishops, who are a step down on the ladder. It's to the best of my understanding. I'm sorry if I get this wrong. It's you're a priest, then a bishop, then archbishop, cardinal. Sometimes they can, I think, be an archbishop and a cardinal, and then there's the pope, and only one of those at a time. That I know for a fact. So these bishops go around and they're spread amongst dioceses in the church. So he confiscates the bishop's property, the bishop's church property, and he sells it back to the bishops. He says, all right, you can have this back for whatever it was, 200% of its actual value. So he takes advantage of the situation. He exploits it. Again, not a name you have to remember by any means. J.C. Holt, though, who's just a scholar, suggests that the increased revenues that the king had to take in to defend his territories on the continent of Europe, in France particularly, and financing campaigns in Scotland, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, to expand England's areas of influence, really led him to increase pressure on sources of revenue in England and exhaust those sources of revenue just about. And this is one of the reasons for Holt, anyway, that prompted the Magna Carta, prompted the baronial or the noble rebellion. I buy that it's one of the reasons. I don't think it was the only reason. Just my take on it. So David Carpenter, another scholar, suggests John exploited these sources of revenue way more than his predecessors did. That is a fact. Up until that point, anyway, post John to today, that wasn't. I don't think they were being taxed that much. So, yeah, he says probably the years after 1207 saw the greatest level of financial exploitation since the Norman conquest. So, since 1066, people hadn't been taxed this much. There hadn't been this much burden placed upon families, noble families anyway, to raise taxes and funds from their tenants since England became England, since William came over and conquered it from the Saxons. So part of the money, though, that John raises is used to create a fledgling navy, a fledgling English navy. This isn't the navy that the British would become famous for, but it's a start. we'll call this part one. I'll be back in just a second.